for being here. It's meant so much to have work that is so personal, speak to so many people. And so for this artist talk, I'm thinking I'll give some context, some process details, and then talk a little bit about magical thinking and what that means to me. And then I'll open it up for questions on the individual work and the work itself generally. So, to start off with context, what kind of inspired my thought process, where I was in my personal life before this work. There was a pretty significant loss in my life, not death related, but it was another loss in my personal life that entered me into what is known as the dark night of the soul, if you're familiar with it. If you're not, it is essentially a period of transformation that is very uncomfortable, that involves an identity crisis, a shattering of your belief systems, and basically just questioning the very nature of who you are. One of those belief systems that I mentioned was the Mormon LDS Church. I came out as gay pretty young. I was in high school, or just entering high school, I believe. And my parents were pretty scared of the backlash of what it would mean to come out, so they kind of encouraged me not to come out. And my whole life, from that point forward, I was grappling with expectations of masculinity, living with this chronic sense of wrongness, and just feeling alienated from the people that I loved, from my family, from other queer people, and from time itself. I felt left out of time, and queers are left out of history, and to this day we're still denied the right to love in institutions like the church. But yeah, that personally, that origin story of mine is significant for this body of work. Given that this is my first solo show, I will mention that my work as a student, an undergrad at UNM, preceded this work. And back then, I was very interested in theodicies, which I can describe as explanations for why there is evil in the world. Another term is origin stories. And these two works, feel free to pass it around, I guess I can walk around. Eve and Pandora, some example of student work. These two women were blamed for the fall of mankind. And back then I was interested in just asking that question, like, why is someone culpable? Why is it someone's fault that there's evil in the world? Pandora from Greek mythology and Eve from Judeo-Christianity. Mythology was also a major theme that I turned to in my student work. I was interested in crafting this narrative of a relationship between mankind and nature, both an erotic relationship, but also something very complex that maybe like involved betrayal. I was interested in kind of like an anthology, like maybe a storyline of, in one painting they're lovers, but in the next, man has killed nature. He's a nature spirit. Some influences, majorly is Italian masters like Michelangelo, of course, Baroque, masters like Caravaggio, the use of light and dark. It's known as chiaroscuro, which is basically just this high contrast between light and dark, is a huge influence for my current work and my student work back then. Also, modern influences like Manet, Manet's piece, The Olympia, is actually what inspired this one that's above the couch here. It's common for artists, if you're not an artist and you're not familiar, it's common for artists to take significant works from the past and reimagine them, or say something new, but reference the same piece, I guess. And that is exactly what I was doing with this recreation of Manet's Olympia. And of course, Van Gogh was a major influence. His attention to nature and his application of paint were major influences for me. And getting into contemporary influences, if any of you are familiar with Salman Tor, he is, I can zoom in. He is a contemporary queer figurative painter. He uses this lovely green. He has some of the most beautiful greens in his paintings, and it is narrative based. And also Emma Webster. She is focused a lot on spatial relationships in her work, and she describes it as like she's thinking of stage design in her work, which is something very similar to what I'm doing, thinking of this theatricality, and like the spotlight will be here, this will go here, so kind of spatial relations and atmospheric distance too. I would say that my style mimics multiple styles, so it's not really going for one look. But if I can narrow it down, there is a lot of nudity in the work, and these vast, sublime, kind of cavernous natural settings, and that references European classicism, but also surrealism and the magical realists. So all of those influences, I guess, I could define my style between those three movements. And some more context on this work, I took an outdoor studio class with Rachel Stein at UNM as an undergrad, and I started plein air painting for the first time, and I fell in love with it. It was incredible. It's incredibly difficult if you've never plein air painted. You're basically outdoors, weather is shifting constantly, light is constantly changing, but with this painting outside gave me this new attention to light that helped me master it in these works. And living here in New Mexico, the light is so dramatic, and there's a lot of dappled light. Usually, like when clouds come in and roll over the sky, sometimes there's spotlights of light that shoot and dapple across the land or the mountains, and that, it feels so magical to see that here. So that was a huge inspiration. And also talking about atmospheric distance again, you can see so far, and it's so blue when you look out on the land. One of the reasons why it's called the Land of Enchantment. But I have a quote here from an author, Rebecca Solnit, and she's mentioning this same blue of atmospheric distance because this blue, you've seen it in like the paintings in there. I'm absolutely thinking about atmospheric distance when I'm using that blue, and it's also imbued with longing for me. And she describes it perfectly in what she says. She says, the color of that distance is the color of an emotion, the color of solitude and of desire, the color of there seen from here, the color of where you are not, and the color of where you can never go. For the blue is not in that place those miles away at the horizon, but in the atmospheric distance that lies between you and the mountains. If you were to cross that distance and arrive amongst the mountains themselves aren't blue, but that blue would tint the next beyond. So it's this distance you never arrive in, which is why it's so associated with longing. Following the pandemic, I read this book, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, and it changed my life. It was one of the most important books I've read, in that it deepened my attention to myself and the natural world incredibly. I began to learn the names of local plants and animals that I had passed by my whole life and never really looked at deep enough, or I never knew their names. But this act of looking and naming things shifted my whole reality as I began to notice more of everything. So there's this idea of attention shaping your reality. Your experience is what you agree to attend to. I believe that was William James that says it. It's a quote in here too. It's a beautiful book. So moving away from context and into process, I do have a sketchbook. If you guys want to, after this, feel free to look through it at any time. These are full of just intimate little studies that have little details that just kind of train my attention to these small details. So there's the sketchbook. I also rely a lot on digital collages. I'll show you a picture. So what I'm doing is I'm taking photos that I've taken and blending them with each other or with photos from art history and distorting them. And these serve as basically the maps of my compositions. And I don't plan out what a painting will look like in the end. It always changes and evolves. But these are just a reference point, a starting point. And what I would say I'm doing in this work is marrying opposites. Within the narratives themselves, there is both beauty and terror. So there's this duality that I'm interested in conveying. The way that I'm applying paint mirrors this in that there's both blended, smooth moments, but also thick impasto and like scratchiness. If you've looked closely at some of them literally are just scratched away paint. And you can see the color that was underneath the scratching. I take a palette knife and just scratch away. But that duality of smoothness and roughness is a marriage of opposites. And sometimes there's like dripping and combated with that scratchiness and impasto paint. When it comes to color, I am relying a lot on complementary colors. And if you aren't familiar with that, it is complementary colors lie opposite to each other on the color wheel. I have a little visual to help if there's non-artists here that don't understand, but complementary colors are opposite. So red and green, purple and yellow, and blue and orange. And what that does is putting those together in a painting creates visual interest and it creates tension, just in that they're opposites. And I think that to speak more on why I'm choosing this marriage of opposites in my work is because it very much mirrors reality, if you think about it. I was both gay and Mormon, and life is so full of like that, those crossroads and those dualities and paradoxes. So that's why I'm marrying opposites. So far I've talked about context and process, and now I'll move into the title itself and what magical thinking means to me. The term magical thinking actually came to me through my professor from Florence, Italy. I studied abroad in Italy, and I have kept up with my professor for a few years. We're good friends. And I was essentially, I was talking about, I asked her, when we heal, like as we heal, and as we get better as people, do you believe that there's forces that are working to combat that, forces that are against that? And she brought up this term of magical thinking and what it is to like think magically and believe that it ties into like the paranoia that I was kind of experiencing then that led to that question. But magical thinking is essentially this idea that certain rituals, words, thoughts, and emotions can influence the external world And we are most prone to this as children. When I was really little, I watched Narnia, the Chronicles of Narnia, the first movie. In the first movie, there's that opening scene, and it's a war or something. Planes are like going over the sky and dropping bombs on the city, and I was so terrified of that. That was my biggest fear, is planes dropping bombs on me. And I used to pray every night that please bless that there won't be a war and that there won't be bombs that are dropped on me. And I mean, I believed that in praying, I was essentially causing that not to happen. If I prayed about it, it wouldn't happen. It couldn't. I think that magical thinking is such a big part of human nature. And for this series, I'm thinking about it in both a literal sense, and how I've described it, but also in a more nuanced sense, like what it means to think magically. It can mean multiple things. That's what I'm exploring in this work. But essentially, what it is, I think for me, is this longing for magic, which further translates as a longing for freedom. And of course, it ties into New Age spiritualism too. If you're into New Age spiritualism at all, it involves like tarot cards, tarot reading, astrology, and like the zodiac, and all of that is part of New Age spiritualism. And I see those as very much being in conversation with Christianity in our time. So these paintings, like there's symbols like the cross, and there's a tarot card. Having those two different kinds of spiritualities in conversation with each other, it feels like a hallmark of our time for me personally. And Christianity like is known for paganizing or reducing like other forms of spirituality. So there's that. I see those in conversation with each other. The way to the supernatural lies through the natural. That is a quote by the painter Kandinsky. For a lot of this work, I was walking in nature so much while creating this work, and just seeing how much freedom to nature there is was hugely inspiring. So I decided to replace a lot of the human characters with plants and animals. And I believe that you don't need to have necessarily the human figure itself in order to make a painting that's about humans. So what I'm doing in this work, these plants are telling a story because they're caught up in dramatic gestures, or they're serving as symbols or metaphors. And to close this artist talk, we'll talk a little bit about the vulnerability. In my statement, it says, this body of work explores nuances of magical thinking and the vulnerability it draws us to. For me, I think it's like a human tendency to think magically. It is vulnerable. It's part of what makes us human. And it's very vulnerable to admit that you're afraid to be alone. To admit that maybe you rely on people more than you should. Or that you're hungry for physical touch, for the touch of another human. And all of those things are vulnerabilities that I've arrived at in this work for myself. But I think that there are further vulnerabilities that speak to the viewers themselves. And we live in a culture that is so focused on linear time and growth and production. But this series was my way of finding a new temporality, a new sense of time, one that was less linear and more cyclical or spiral-like, like nature itself. And because my life very much feels that way. It doesn't feel like it just keeps going. It feels like a cycle. there's moments where I'm in a different conduct, and we aren't built for consistency of conduct. So yeah, when I look at my life, I see this cycle, and I have also felt like there's this like ugliness, like it looks like a labyrinth. It's so twisted and dark, and so full of mistakes and shame, and but looking through a nature lens, like nature is full of that same twistedness, that same darkness, just as riddled with loss and change as our lives. So there is this sense of like seeing a reflection of your own life in nature, in this work, and this question, if I look deep enough, what do I notice about myself, is what I was asking. And ultimately, I am thinking about these paintings as sort of like a queer mythology, adding to queer history, I guess, through these stories, but also as fragments of a larger story about humanity that is encountering an apocalypse. I also see these paintings as a string of different apocalypses within one individual life. I think that living in our time, all we hear about is doom. We hear a lot of doom. And there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the future. That's the question that we're forced to confront. We're forced to think about the end. But if you look at the life of an individual, there's a million endings and beginnings. And ultimately that brings me at a place of hope. Yeah. I'd like to open it up for questions now, if you guys have any. Thank you.
Did you find any emotional struggle in completing any specific piece? Like, was there something that really like just tug at your heartstrings in a way that maybe, you know, you had some struggle with like finishing it or anything like that? Because a lot of these are very personal.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that that piece with in the forest, I see it. I mean, I don't want to bring the meaning because I want people to take their own meaning, but for me, that beast is God, is the Judeo-Christian God that I grew up with. And something about that piece was so healing, but also so triggering, and so like it brought so much up, because it's about that feeling of being reduced and dismissed, seen as lesser, seen as sinful, or it's also just about moments when life kind of spits you out and you feel so small. You're just there on the ground, trying to crawl somewhere. But yeah, I would say that piece. Good question.
It's not really a question, but more of like what you said about beauty and terror. That is kind of the thing I was trying to say. I was like, I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Could you maybe speak more to that and like the way that it makes you feel? Is it conflicting? Is it like a resolution, or is it just a question all the time?
That's an excellent question. I think that it is a question. Like it is like, I think it's very much how life is. It's full of those dualities. It's full of beauty and terror. Things that seemingly like should cancel each other out, or like they don't belong together in the same life or the same image. But for me, it kind of putting them together holds open more space for nuance, for more complexity and paradox. And I think that, it's easy to see things one way, to see things in black and white, but in like marrying those opposites, and marrying beauty and terror, there's there's so much more to see. There's so much more to life too, and there's space for multiple conflicting things.
Like a reconciliation almost.
Yeah, reconciliation. Absolutely. Any other questions?
Before you noticed nature so much, what would you say was like filling that space? Like, because now it seems like that's a big space that we're supposed to be in. But I don't know if that's your question or not. But like, you know, like
Before nature, what was
Yeah.
filling the space?
yeah,
That's a good question, I think. There was a period before entering my dark night of the soul. There was this period of like just ignorance and oblivion. I think like when I look back, I can't fully grasp the way that I was thinking. It feels like a fog because my attention wasn't as granular as it is now. It was very small. Like the scope of my attention is so small. It was also like so centered on shame and self-loathing. There really was no place, no space of openness or relief. I think that was always like I've always been inner drawn and like my inner world, in my own inner world. So I was there, but it was dark. It was dark.
it's just kind of freeing.
Yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely. If there are no more questions, I want to thank you guys again so much. And if you haven't already, look super close at them, like get like a feel for the texture, and then look at them from really far away, and just like let it come over you like a wave.